Part 3, The Book of Love, Chapters 28 and 29 of The Book of Life by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28, The Reality of Marriage, discusses the sex customs now existing in the world and their relation to the ideal of monogamous love. Just as human beings, through wrong religious beliefs, torture one another and wreck their lives and happiness, just as through wrong eating and other physical habits they make disease and misery for themselves, just so they suffer and perish for lack of the most elementary knowledge concerning the sex relationship. The difference is that in the field of religious ideas, it is now permissible to impart the truth one possesses. If I tell you there is no devil, and that believing this will not cause you to suffer in an eternity of sulfur and brimstone, no one will be able to burn me at the stake, even though he might like to do so. If I advise you that it is not harmful to eat beefsteak on Friday, or to eat thoroughly cooked pork on any day of the week, neither the archbishops, nor the rabbis, nor the vegetarians will be able to lock me in a dungeon. But if I should impart to you the simplest and most necessary bit of knowledge concerning the facts of your sex life, things which every man and woman must know if we are to stop breeding imbecility and degeneracy in the world, then I should be liable, under federal statutes, to pay a fine of $5,000 and to serve a term of 5 years in a federal penitentiary. Scarcely a week passes that I do not receive a letter from someone asking for information about such matters. But I dare not answer the letters, because I know there are agencies, maintained and paid by religious superstition, employing spies to trap people into the breaking of this law. I shall tell you here as much as I am permitted to tell, in the simplest language and the most honest spirit. I believe that human beings are meant to be happy on this earth, and to avoid misery and disease. I believe that they are given the powers of intelligence in order to seek the ways of happiness, and I believe that it is a worthy work to give them the knowledge they need in order to find happiness. At the outset of this book of love, we are going to examine the existing facts of the sex relationships of men and women in present-day society. We shall discover that amid all the false and dishonest thinking of mankind, there is nowhere more falsity and dishonesty than here. The whole world is a gigantic conspiracy of hush, and the orthodox and respectable of the world are like worshippers of some god, who spend their daytime burning incense before the altar, and in the nighttime steal the sacred jewels and devour the consecrated offerings. These worshippers confront you with the question, do you believe in marriage? And they make the assumption that the institution of marriage exists, or at some time has existed, in the world. But if you wish to do any sound thinking about the subject, you must get one thing clear at the outset. The institution of marriage is an ideal which has been preached and taught, but which has never anywhere in any society at any stage of human progress actually existed as the general practice of mankind. What has existed and still exists is a very different institution, which I shall here describe as marriage plus prostitution. By this statement, I do not mean to deny that there are many women and a few men who have been monogamous all their lives, nor that there are many couples living together happily in monogamous marriage. What I mean is that considering society as a whole, wherever you find the institution of marriage, you also find, coexistent therewith and complementary thereto, the institution of prostitution. Of this double arrangement, one part is recognized and written into the law, and the other part is hidden and prohibited by law. But those who have to do with enforcing the law all know that it exists, and practically all of them consider it inevitable. And a great many derive income from it. So I say, if you believe in marriage plus prostitution, that is your right. But if marriage is what you believe in, then your task is to consider such questions as these. Is marriage a possible thing? Can it ever become the sex arrangement of any society? What are the forces which have so far prevented it from prevailing, and how can these forces be counteracted? It is my belief that monogamous love is the most desirable of human sex relationships, the most fruitful in happiness and spiritual development. The laws and institutions of civilized society pretend to defend this relationship, but the briefest study of the facts will convince anyone that these laws and institutions are not really meant to protect monogamous love. What they are is a device of the property-holding male to secure his property rights to women, and more especially to secure himself as to the paternity of his heirs. In primitive society, where land and other sources of wealth were held in common, and sex monogamy was unknown, there was no way to determine paternity, and no reason for doing so. But under the system of private property and class privilege, it is necessary for some one man to support a child, if it is to be supported. And when a man has fought hard and robbed hard and traded hard and acquired wealth, he does not want to spend it in maintaining another man's child. That he should let himself be fooled into doing so is one of the greatest humiliations his fellow man can imagine. If you read Shakespeare's plays and look up the meaning of old words so as to understand old witticisms and allusions, you will discover that this was the stock jest of Shakespeare's time. In order to protect himself from such ridicule, the man maintained in ancient times his right to kill the faithless woman with cruel tortures. He maintains today the right to deprive her of her children and of all share in his property, even though she may have helped to earn it. But until quite recent times, the beginning of the revolt of women, there was never any corresponding penalty for faithlessness in husbands. Under the English law today, the husband may divorce his wife for infidelity, but the wife must prove infidelity plus cruelty, and the courts have held that the cruelty must consist in knocking her down. While I was in England, the highest court rendered a decision that a man who brought his mistress to his home and compelled his wife to wait upon her was not committing cruelty in the meaning of the English law. This is what is known as the double standard, and the double standard prevails everywhere under the system of marriage plus prostitution, and proves that capitalist monogamy is not a spiritual ideal, but a matter of class privilege. It is a breach of honor for the ruling class male to tamper with the wife of his friend. It is frequently dangerous for him to tamper with the young females of his own class, but it is in general practice taken for granted that the young females of lower classes are his legitimate prey. In England, a man may have a marriage annulled if he can prove that the woman he married had what is called a past. But everybody takes it for granted that the man has had a past. It is covered by the polite phrase, sowing his wild oats. Wherever among the ruling class you find men bold enough to discuss the facts of the sex order they have set up, you find the idea expressed or implied that this wild oats is a necessary and inevitable part of this order, and that without it the order would break down. The English philosopher Lecky, making an elaborate study of morals through the ages, speaks of the prostitute in the following frank language: herself the supreme type of vice, she is ultimately the most efficient guardian of virtue. But for her, the unchallenged purity of countless happy homes would be polluted, and not a few who, in the pride of their untempted chastity, think of her with an indignant shudder, would have known the agony of remorse and despair. On that one degraded and ignoble form are concentrated the passions that might have filled the world with shame. She remains, while creeds and civilizations rise and fall, the eternal priestess of humanity, blasted for the sins of the people. I invite you to study these sentences and understand them fully. Remember that they are the opinion of the most learned historian of sex customs who has ever written in English, a man whose authority is recognized in our schools, whose books are in every college library. William Edward Hartpole Lecky is not in any sense a revolutionist. He is a conventional English scholar, an upholder of English law and order and patriotism. He is not of my school of thought, but of those who now own the world and run it. I quote him because he tells in plain language what kind of world they have made. I invite you to study his words, and then judge my statement that the sex arrangement under which we live in modern society is not monogamous love, but marriage plus prostitution. It is my hope to point the way to a higher system. I should like to call it marriage, but perhaps it would be more precise to call it marriage minus prostitution. In working it out, we shall have to think for ourselves and discard all formulas. It is obvious that our present-day religious creeds, ethical ideals, legal codes, and social rewards and punishments have been powerless to protect marriage, or to make it the rule in sex relationships. So we shall have to begin at the beginning and find new reasons for monogamous love, a new basis for marriage other than the protection of private property. We shall have to inform ourselves as to the fundamental purposes of sex. We shall have to ask ourselves, what are the factors which determine rightness and wrongness in the sex relationship? What is love, and what ought it to be? These questions we shall try to approach without any fixed ideas whatever. We shall decide them by the same tests that we have used in our thinking about God and immortality, health and disease. We shall ask not what our ancestors believed, not what God teaches us, not what the law ordains, not what is respectable, nor yet what is advanced, according to the claim of modern sex revolutionists and free lovers. We shall ask ourselves, what are the facts? We shall ask, what can be made to work in practice? What can justify itself by the tests of reason and common sense? End of chapter 28. Chapter 29. The development of marriage deals with the sex relationship, its meaning and its history, the stages of its development in human society. What, in the most elemental form, is sex? It is a difference of function which makes it necessary for two organisms to take part in the reproduction of the species. The purpose, or at any rate the effect, of this sex difference is the mixing of characteristics and qualities. If the sex relationship were unnecessary to reproduction, variations might begin and be propagated and carried to extremes in one line of inheritance without ever affecting the rest of the species. Very soon there would be no species, or rather an infinity of them. Each line of descent would fly apart and become a group all by itself. You have perhaps heard people comment on the fact that blondes so frequently prefer brunettes, and that tall men are apt to marry short women, and vice versa. This is perhaps nature's way of keeping the type uniform, of spreading qualities widely and testing them thoroughly. Nature is continually trying out the powers of every individual in every species, and by the process of sexual selection, she chooses for the reproduction of the species the individuals which are best fitted for survival. This, of course, refers to nature, considered apart from man. In human society, as I shall presently show, sexual selection has been distorted and partly suppressed. Sex differentiation and sexual selection exist almost universally throughout the animal and vegetable kingdoms, everywhere save in the lowest forms of being. They take strange and startling forms, and like everything else in nature, manifest amazing ingenuity. People who wish to prove this or that about human sex relations will advance arguments from nature, but as a matter of fact, we can learn nothing whatever from nature, except her determination to preserve the products of her activity and to keep them up to standard. Sometimes nature will give the precedence in power, speed, and beauty to the male, and sometimes to the female. She is perfectly ruthless and willing in the accomplishment of her purpose to destroy the individuals of either sex. She will content the most rabid feminist by causing the female spider to devour her mate when his purpose has been accomplished, or by causing the male bee to fall from his mating in the air, a disemboweled shell. As for man, he has won his supremacy over nature by his greater power to combine in groups, by his more intense gregarious or herd instincts, which enabled him to fight and destroy creatures which would have exterminated him if he had fought them alone. So in primitive society everywhere, we find that the individual is subordinated to the group, and the folk ways give but little heed to personal rights. Very thorough investigations have been made into the life of primitive man in many parts of the world, and the anthropologists are now arguing over the exact meaning of the data. We shall not here attempt to decide among them, but rest content with the statement that communism and tribal ownership is a widespread social form among primitive man, so much so as to suggest that it is an early stage in social evolution. And this communism includes not merely property, but sex. In the very earliest days, there was often no barrier whatever to the sex relationship, not even between brothers and sisters, nor between parents and children. In fact, we find savages who do not know that the sex relationship has anything to do with procreation. But as knowledge increases, sex taboos develop, some wise and some foolish. From causes not entirely clear, but which we discuss in chapter 48, there gradually evolves a widespread form of sex relationship of primitive man, the system of the gens, as it is called. This is the Latin word for family, but it does not mean family in the narrow sense of mother and father and children, but in the broad sense of all those who have blood relationship, however far removed, uncles and aunts and cousins, as far as memory can trace. In primitive communism, a man is not permitted to enter into the sex relationship with a woman of the same gens, but with all other women of some other gens. It is difficult for us to imagine a society in which all the men named Jones would be married to all the women named Smith. But that was the way whole races of mankind lived for many thousands of years. In that primitive communist society, the woman was generally the equal of the man. It is true that she did the drudgery of the camp, but the man, on the other hand, faced the hardships of battle and the chase on land and sea. The woman was as big as the man, and except when handicapped by pregnancy, as strong as the man. She was as respected, if not more so. Her children bore her name, and were under her control, and she was accustomed to assert herself in all affairs of the tribe. In Frederick O'Brien's White Shadows in the South Seas, you may read a comical story of a journey this traveler made into the interior of one of the cannibal islands. Everywhere he was treated with courtesy and hospitality, but was embarrassed by continual offers from would-be wives. In one case, a powerful cannibal lady, whose advances he rejected, picked him up and proceeded to carry him off, and he was quite helpless in her grasp. He might have been a cannibal husband today, if it had not been for the intervention of his fellow travelers. The basis of this sex equality under primitive communism is easy to understand. All goods belonged to the tribe, and were shared alike according to need. Children were the tribe's most precious possession, therefore the women suffered little handicap from having a child to bear and feed. Primitive woman would bear her child by the roadside and pick it up in her arms and continue her journey, and when she needed food, she did not have to beg for it. If there was food for anyone, there was food for her and her child. She did her share of the gathering and preparing of food, because that was the habit and law of her being. She had energies, and had never heard of the idea of not using them. This primitive communism generally disappears as the tribe progresses. We cannot be sure of all the stages of its disappearance, or of the causes, but in a general way we can say that it gives way before the spread of slavery. In the beginning, primitive man does not have any slaves. He does not have sufficient foresight or self-restraint for that. When he kills his enemies in battle, he builds a fire and roasts their flesh and eats them. And those whom he captures alive, he binds fast and takes with him to be sacrificed to his voodoo gods. But as he comes to more settled ways of living, and as the tribe grows larger, it occurs to the chiefs in battle that the captives would be glad to give their labor in return for their lives, and that it would be convenient to have some people to do the hard and dirty work. So gradually there comes to be a class at the bottom of society, and another class at the top. Those who capture the slaves and keep them at work lay claim to the products of their labor. At first, better weapons and personal adornments. Then, separate homes for the chiefs and priests, separate gardens, separate flocks and herds, and, what more natural, separate women. This process becomes complete when the tribe settles down to agriculture, and the ruling classes take possession of the land. When once the land is privately owned, classes are fixed, and class distinctions become the most prominent fact in society. And step by step, as this happens, we see women beaten down from the position of the cannibal lady, who could ask for the man she wanted and carry him off by force if necessary, to the position of the modern woman, who is physically weak, emotionally unstable, economically dependent, and socially repressed. You may resent such phrases, but all you have to do is to read the laws of civilized countries written into the statute books by men to define the rights and duties of women. You will see that everywhere, before the recent feminist revolt, women were classified under the law with children and imbeciles. Maternity imposes on woman a heavy burden, and before the discovery of birth control, a burden that is continuous. For 9 months she carries the child in her body, and then for a year or two she carries it in her arms or on her back, and by that time there is another child, and this continues until she is broken down. Having this burden, she cannot possibly compete with the unburdened male for the possession of property. So wherever there is economic competition, wherever certain individuals or classes in the tribe or group are allowed to seize and hold the land, wherever the products of labor cease to be the community property and become private property, the objects of economic strife, then invariably and by natural process, woman comes to be placed among those who cannot protect themselves, that is, among the children and the imbeciles and the slaves. Of course, some children are well cared for, and so are some imbeciles and some slaves and some women. But they are cared for as a matter of favor, not as a matter of their own power. They proceed no longer as the cannibal lady, but by adopting and cultivating the slave virtues, by making themselves agreeable to their masters, by flattering their masters' vanity and sensuality. In other words, by exercising what we are accustomed to call feminine charm. From early barbaric society up to the present day, we observe that there are classes of women just as there are classes of men. The position of these classes changes within certain limits, but in broad outline the conditions are fixed and may be easily defined. There is, first of all, the ruling class woman. She must have birth. She may or may not have wealth, according as to whether the laws of that society or tribe permit her to have possessions of her own, or to inherit anything from her parents. If she has no wealth, then she will need beauty. She is the woman who is selected by the ruling class man to bear his name and his children, and to have charge of the household where these children are reared, and trained for the inheriting of their father's wealth and the carrying on of his position. This confers upon the ruling class woman great dignity, and makes her a person of responsibility. She rules not merely over the slaves of the household, but over men of inferior social classes. And in a few cases, an exceptionally able woman has become a queen and ruled over men of her own class. This ruling class woman has been known through all the ages by a special name, and the ways and customs regarding her have been studied in an entertaining book, The Lady, by Emily James Putnam. Next in privilege and position to the lady is the mistress, the woman who is selected by the ruling class man not primarily to bear his children, but to entertain and divert him. She may, of course, bear children also. In barbaric societies, and up to quite recent times, the importance of the ruling class man was indicated by the number of concubines he had, and the position of these women was hardly inferior to that of the wife or queen. In the days of the French monarchy, the king's mistress was frequently more important than the queen. She was a woman of ability, maintaining her supremacy in the intrigues of the court. In ancient Greek society, the hetairai were a recognized class, and Aspasia, the mistress of Pericles, was the most brilliant and most conspicuous woman in Athens. In modern France, the position of the mistress is recognized by the phrase demi-monde, or half-world. The American plutocracy has developed upon a superstructure of Puritanism, and therefore in America hypocrisy is necessary. But in the great cities of America, the vast majority of the ruling class men keep mistresses before marriage, and a great many keep them afterwards. And these mistresses are coming to be more and more openly flaunted, and to acquire more and more of what is called social position. It is possible now in the smart set for a lady to accept the status of mistress, delicately veiled, without losing caste thereby, and actresses and other freelance women who get their start in life by taking the position of a mistress are coming more and more to be recognized as ladies, and to be received into what are called the best circles. There remains to be considered the position of lower class women. In barbarous societies, these women were very little different from slaves. They had no rights of their own, except such rights as their master man chose to allow them for his own convenience. They were sold in marriage by their parents, and they went where they were sold, and obeyed their new master. They became his household drudges, and reserved their affections for him. If they failed to do this, he stoned them to death, or strangled them with a cord, and tied them in a sack and threw them into the river. And, of course, the rights of the master man yielded to the rights of the men of higher classes. The king or nobleman could take any woman he wished at any time, and he made laws to this effect and enforced them. In feudal society, the lord of the manor claimed the right of the first night with the wives of his serfs. This was one of the ruling class privileges which was abolished in the French Revolution. Wherever the French Revolution did not succeed in effecting land tenure, the right of the landowner to prey upon his tenant girls continues as a custom, even though it is not written in the law, and would be denied by the hypocritical. It prevails in Poland, as you may discover by reading Sienkiewicz's Whirlpools. It prevails in England, as you may discover from Hardy's Tess of the d'Urberville. You will find that it prevails in every part of the world where women have poverty and men have wealth and prestige, dress suits and automobiles. You will find it wherever there are leisure class hotels or colleges or other gatherings of ruling class young males. You will find it in the theatrical and moving picture worlds. It is well understood in the theatrical world of Broadway that the woman star in the profession gets her start in life by becoming the mistress of a manager or angel. In the moving picture world of Southern California, it is a recognized convention, known to everyone familiar with the business, that a young girl parts with her virtue in exchange for an important job. End of chapter 29.